What if the world's greatest civilization, one of golden temples, towering pyramids, and a godlike pharaoh, was always just one invasion away from destruction? Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile. Behind you, fields of grain sway gently in the wind. Ahead, across the desert horizon, you see a cloud of dust rising. Horses, chariots, foreign warriors with steel in their eyes. Suddenly, the very heart of Egypt, the civilization that had mastered the desert, harnessed the Nile, and built monuments to eternity, was under threat. The story of ancient Egypt is not just one of peace, prosperity, and splendor. It is also the story of survival. For thousands of years, Egypt stood as a beacon of wealth that others craved. From nomadic raiders to foreign empires, enemies always circled. And yet, Egypt endured. How? What did their military do to protect a kingdom that seemed too tempting for the world to resist? This is not the tale of kings carved in stone, nor just of battles written in dusty scrolls. This is the living, beating story of soldiers who stood on scorching sands, gripping spears until their hands bled, of generals who outwitted foes with cunning strategies, of pharaohs who believed their thrones were divine, but who also knew that without warriors, their crowns could fall in a single night. Tonight, we step into their world, into the clash of bronze against bronze, into the roar of war chariots racing across the desert, into the very heartbeat of a civilization that refused to die. The question is, can we uncover the secrets of Egypt's defenders, the men and strategies that held the kingdom together for 3,000 years? Number 1. The Desert Wall, Egypt's first and greatest defense. What if Egypt's strongest soldier wasn't a man, but the land itself? To the ancient world, Egypt was a paradise carved out of an unforgiving desert. On the banks of the Nile, fertile fields glowed green, feeding millions. But all around, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction, lay the most merciless of guardians, the desert. Sand dunes that rolled endlessly, heat that could scorch the flesh, and a thirst so deadly it could slay an army before a single spear was raised. For centuries, the desert acted as Egypt's first wall of defense. Raiders from the east had to cross blistering wastes. Enemies from the west had to survive salt flats and shifting dunes. To the south, the cataracts of the Nile, the violent rapids and rocky barriers, stood as natural fortresses against invasion. The desert gave Egypt time. It slowed its enemies, drained their strength, and in many cases, destroyed them before they even arrived. But here is the hidden truth. No wall, no matter how vast, is impenetrable. Desperation drives men to risk the impossible. Gold, grain, and glory lured invaders toward the Nile Valley. The Libyans pressed from the west, the Nubians from the south, and the Asiatic tribes from the east. Each wave of attackers tried to breach this natural barrier. Egypt's military leaders knew they could not simply wait behind the sand. They had to act. And so, pharaohs ordered the construction of fortresses at Egypt's edges. Mud brick walls rose at desert crossings. Watchtowers loomed over trade routes. Soldiers patrolled the frontiers, not only defending but listening. Scouts trained to read the desert, to spot the dust trails of enemy movement long before they reached the valley. Imagine the life of a border guard. He stands under the burning sun, skin cracked from heat, eyes squinting against the horizon. Every day he looks for signs, a glint of metal, a formation of riders, a distant shimmer of movement that means war is coming. He knows that if he fails to raise the alarm, villages will burn, temples will be plundered, and families will be slaughtered. Egypt's military transformed the desert from a natural shield into a living system of surveillance and control. Roads were cut through the sand, allowing soldiers to move faster than invaders. Signal fires carried warnings from tower to tower, spreading news of danger at speeds unmatched for their age. And yet, the Nile itself posed a deadly contradiction. Its richness, the breadbasket of the ancient world, was a beacon that drew hungry eyes from every direction. The same river that nourished Egypt made it irresistible to conquerors. So while the desert gave Egypt breathing room, the pharaohs knew it was only the beginning. The invaders who survived the sands would eventually stand at the edge of the Nile Valley. And when they did, Egypt could no longer rely on nature alone. They would need men. They would need warriors. They would need an army capable of defending paradise. But who were these men? Were they trained killers, or ordinary people pressed into battle? The answer is both, because Egypt's first line of flesh and blood defense came not from nobles or professional soldiers, but from the very fields of the Nile itself. And so, the story of Egypt's army begins with its most humble defenders, the foot soldiers. Number 2. The foot soldiers, the backbone of Pharaoh's army, who stood shoulder to shoulder, spears raised, when invaders finally crossed the desert and reached the Nile. Not kings, not generals, but farmers, fishermen, and builders, the ordinary men of Egypt who became its shield. The Egyptian army was built from the lifeblood of its people. Every harvest, Pharaoh could call upon thousands of men, drawn from the villages of the Nile Valley. They were not soldiers by trade. They were men who tilled the soil, raised cattle, and built monuments. But when Egypt called, they became warriors. Picture the transformation. A farmer, bare-chested and sunburnt, lays down his plow. He is handed a spear tipped with bronze, a shield of wood and leather, and a simple linen kilt for battle. Overnight, he shifts from feeding his family to defending his homeland. These foot soldiers fought in formations, lines of men with shields locked together, spears bristling outward. It was a wall of flesh and wood, meant to hold the enemy back through sheer discipline. In the heat of battle, their survival depended not on individual skill, but on trust. Trust that the man beside them would not break. Trust that the shield wall would hold. Training was harsh. Pharaohs established barracks and drill fields where men marched for hours beneath the sun, practiced spear thrusts until their arms ached, and learned to move as one body. They were taught to obey without hesitation. In war, hesitation meant death, not just for the soldier, but for the kingdom. But these men carried more than weapons into battle. They carried emotion. Imagine a fisherman from Memphis, called to defend the Delta against Libyan raiders. He kisses his wife goodbye, knowing that if he fails, her village may be reduced to ash. He fights not for Pharaoh's glory alone, but for his family, his farm, his gods. And yet, the foot soldiers' courage was only part of the story. Against ordinary raiders, they could hold their ground. But when foreign armies arrived with new weapons, swift horses, fast-moving chariots, iron-tipped arrows, the wall of men began to falter. Egypt needed something stronger, something faster, something that could strike fear before the enemy even touched the shield line. The answer came on wheels, 2 horses pulling a weapon that would transform the battlefield forever. The chariot. Number 3. Chariots of fire, Egypt's deadly secret weapon. What weapon transformed Egypt's army from a wall of farmers into a force that could dominate empires? The answer came with wheels. The war chariot was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen before. At its core, it was a simple invention. 2-spoked wheels, a light wooden frame, pulled by a pair of horses. But in the hands of the Egyptians, it became something far more than a cart. It was a weapon of terror, speed, and precision. Yet Egypt did not invent the chariot. The Hyksos, foreign invaders from the east, brought it with them when they stormed across the Sinai around 1650 BC. Egypt's armies, still made of massed infantry, collapsed before these fast-moving machines. For over a century, Egypt lived under foreign rule. The humiliation burned deep. Pharaohs were dethroned, temples looted, and Egyptians became subjects in their own land. But out of this humiliation came transformation. Egyptians studied the chariot. They learned its strengths, its weaknesses. When the Hyksos were finally expelled, Egypt didn't just copy the chariot, they reinvented it. Egyptian craftsmen designed lighter, faster versions. Where Hyksos chariots were heavy and slow, Egyptian chariots darted like falcons across the battlefield. They used spoked wheels instead of solid ones, reducing weight. They shifted the axle to the rear, giving greater balance and allowing archers to fire even while moving at full speed. What began as a foreign weapon became the very heart of Egypt's military power. Now imagine the battlefield. The sun beats down, dust swirls in choking clouds, and 2 armies face each other. Infantry lines stretched across the sand, spears bristling. Suddenly, the ground begins to rumble. From behind Egypt's shield wall, they appear. Sleek chariots, horses foaming at the mouth, banners snapping in the wind. The noise is overwhelming. The thunder of hooves, the grinding of wheels, and then the rain of arrows. Archers aboard the chariots were trained to shoot in rapid succession. At full gallop, they could unleash volleys of arrows into enemy lines, cutting down soldiers before the clash of hand-to-hand combat. Against this storm of death, many armies simply broke. The chariot was not just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. And it wasn't only soldiers who rode them. Pharaohs themselves led from the chariot. Imagine Ramesses II, his golden crown gleaming, bow drawn tight, galloping at the head of his army. To his soldiers, this was proof that the gods favored them. To his enemies, it was a vision of divine wrath descending upon them. But the chariot was not flawless. It needed flat ground to be effective. Rocky terrain or swampy soil could break wheels, flip frames, or trap horses. Skilled enemy spearmen learned to form bristling walls, forcing chariots to slow. When momentum faltered, a chariot became a fragile cage, its riders vulnerable. This meant Egypt could not rely on chariots alone. They were the hammer, but only when combined with the anvil of disciplined infantry. Pharaohs who understood this balance, who timed their chariot charges with precision, could break even the mightiest foes. And break them they did. The chariot became Egypt's signature weapon, carrying them into battles across the Levant, into the lands of Canaan, against Libyan raiders and Nubian rebels. Wherever the golden chariot wheels turned, Egypt's enemies trembled. Yet one question remains. What happens when another empire, just as mighty, also masters the chariot? The answer would come in one of history's most famous battles, when Egypt's chariots collided with the Hittites in a clash so great, the desert itself seemed to tremble. Number 4. Kadesh, the clash that shook empires. What happens when two powers, each armed with thousands of chariots, collide in the largest chariot battle the world has ever seen? It was around 1274 BC. Ramesses II, known as the Great, marched north to reclaim lost Egyptian lands in Syria. His target, the city of Kadesh. But he was not the only ruler with ambitions there. The Hittites, a rising power from Anatolia, also sought control of the region. For decades, Egypt and the Hittites circled each other, neither willing to back down. At Kadesh, their rivalry would erupt into full-scale war. Ramesses marched with 4 great divisions of his army, each 1,000 strong, supported by hundreds of chariots. Confident in his strength, he advanced boldly. But the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, had laid a trap. He sent spies disguised as deserters into Ramesses' camp. These men told the pharaoh that the Hittite army was far away, unprepared. Trusting their words, Ramesses pushed forward recklessly, with only part of his force. Suddenly, from behind the walls of Kadesh, the Hittite chariot corps erupted, thousands of war chariots, surging forward like a tidal wave of bronze and wood. The Egyptians were caught completely unprepared. Dust and screams filled the air as Hittite chariots tore into their camps, crushing tents, scattering soldiers, trampling men beneath hooves. Entire divisions buckled under the sudden shock. Panic spread. For a moment, it seemed Egypt's army would be destroyed. But here, the story twists. Ramesses himself, the pharaoh who claimed divine blood, leapt into his chariot. Bow in hand, reins clenched, he charged straight into the chaos. His inscriptions, grand, perhaps exaggerated, describe him as a lion in battle, a god among men. Whether entirely true or not, one fact is clear. His courage rallied his soldiers. Egyptian chariots counterattacked, maneuvering with precision, raining arrows on the Hittites. The tide turned. Dust clouds thickened as thousands of horses screamed, wheels clashed, and men fell crushed beneath the chaos. By the day's end, neither side had won a decisive victory. Ramesses claimed triumph, carving the tale on temple walls in bold reliefs, depicting himself as single-handedly saving his army. The Hittites, too, boasted a victory. In truth, Kadesh ended in stalemate, but it left behind something far more valuable than conquest. The first known peace treaty in history. The clash of Kadesh revealed a truth Egypt could not ignore. Chariots alone could not guarantee victory. Discipline, intelligence, and strategy mattered as much as divine courage. The pharaohs learned. Their armies grew more sophisticated, more structured. Egypt was no longer a land defended only by farmers with spears or noblemen in chariots. It was becoming a professional force. But armies are more than weapons and battles. To survive, Egypt needed structure, hierarchy, and leaders who could command across hundreds of miles. Which leads to the next question. How did Egypt's military evolve from hastily raised militias into one of the most organized fighting machines of the ancient world? Number 5. Commanders, generals, and the rise of military power. Who truly commanded Egypt's armies? Was it Pharaoh alone, or did shadows move behind the throne? Pharaoh was always the face of Egypt's might. Carved into temple walls, he appeared as the ultimate warrior, bow drawn, smiting captives, trampling enemies beneath his chariot wheels. To the people, Pharaoh was the living Horus, chosen by the gods to rule and to protect. But the reality of war is more complicated. A single man cannot command thousands in the chaos of battle. Behind the shining image of Pharaoh stood an entire hierarchy of generals, officers, and scribes. These men planned campaigns, organized logistics, trained soldiers, and managed supplies. Without them, even the most divine king would be helpless. By the new kingdom, Egypt's army had become highly professional. At its head was Pharaoh, but beneath him stood commanders who led divisions named after gods. Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Seth. Each division numbered thousands of soldiers, complete with infantry, chariots, and support crews. Generals oversaw maneuvers, while scribes meticulously recorded rations, troop numbers, and weapons. Imagine the scale of such an operation. An army on campaign needed not just fighters but food, water, tools, and weapons for every man. A march across desert terrain required storage depots, caravans of donkeys, and fleets of ships moving along the Nile. Officers coordinated all of this, ensuring that the army could move like a single living body. For many generals, war was also opportunity. Success in battle meant rewards of land, treasure, and political influence. Some became so powerful they rivaled Pharaoh himself. Generals could command loyalty from thousands of men, making them dangerous allies or dangerous enemies. But the pharaohs knew how to keep their grip. They surrounded themselves with trusted commanders, often family members or nobles bound by loyalty. Rewards flowed, but so did surveillance. No general could forget, the army belonged to Pharaoh, not to them. Still, the loyalty of commanders was constantly tested. In times of crisis, could Pharaoh truly count on them? Or would ambition turn allies into rivals? This fragile balance of power would shape Egypt's military for centuries. It ensured strength, but also sowed seeds of intrigue. For behind the shining banners of Egypt's armies, there was always a shadow. The knowledge that power on the battlefield could one day challenge power on the throne. But Egypt's survival was not just about men and leaders. It was also about walls, fortresses, and the raw strength of stone. Which raises the next question. When armies threatened Egypt's borders, what fortresses stood to block their way? Number 6. Fortresses of stone. Egypt's walls against the world. What stands when men falter? What holds back enemies when soldiers are scattered? For Egypt, the answer was stone. Pharaohs understood that armies cannot be everywhere at once. Invaders could strike at the borders, while Egypt's forces were away on campaigns. To counter this, Egypt built fortresses, massive strongholds of mud, brick, and stone, standing like sentinels at the edges of the kingdom. Some of the earliest rose in Nubia, the land to the south. There, the Nile narrows into cataracts and rocky channels. Egypt built chains of fortresses at places like Buhen, Semna, and Medjay, looming walls that guarded the river. Imagine towering ramparts, watchtowers piercing the sky, gates bristling with wooden spikes. From their battlements, Egyptian archers could rain down arrows on any who dared to cross. But these forts were more than military bases. They were living towns. Inside, soldiers lived with their families. There were granaries stocked with food, wells for water, temples for worship, and barracks for training. In times of peace, these fortresses became centers of trade and culture. In times of war, they transformed into engines of defense. To the north, the delta was another story. Flat, open, and threaded with countless channels of the Nile, it was harder to defend. So Egypt built a line of border defenses known as the walls of the ruler. These were fortifications and checkpoints, controlling who could pass into Egypt from Canaan and the Levant. Traders, diplomats, and migrants had to pass through guarded gates. Soldiers stood watch, scribes recorded names, and scouts tracked movements beyond the frontier. But fortresses alone could not stop determined enemies. The Hyksos had shown that even the strongest walls could fall if defenders were unprepared. So the Egyptians combined fortifications with mobility. Garrison troops were ready to ride out, to chase raiders before they could vanish back into the desert. Imagine being a young soldier stationed at Buhin, far from the green fields of home. Nights are long. The desert wind howls through the walls. He sharpens his spear, listening for distant drums or war horns. He knows that if Nubian warriors come storming out of the south, his fortress must hold, because behind him lies the Nile Valley, the heart of Egypt itself. Fortresses gave Egypt breathing room. They bought time. They allowed pharaohs to project power deep into foreign lands while still knowing their borders were secure. They were symbols as much as weapons, proof to enemies that Egypt was not just a river kingdom, but a walled empire, ready to resist. And yet, no fortress is eternal. Time wears down stone. Loyalty weakens. A garrison can be bribed. A wall can be scaled. When great empires rise, walls alone cannot hold them back. Which raises the next question. How did Egypt deal with enemies who would not be stopped by walls, enemies who came back again and again, wave after wave? The answer lies in the endless struggles with Egypt's most persistent foes, the Libyans. Number 7. Libyans and the endless desert wars. What happens when your enemy is not an empire with cities to conquer, but nomads who vanish into the desert after every strike? For Egypt, this was the problem of the Libyans. From the west, across the endless sands, tribes of Libyan warriors pressed against Egypt's borders for centuries. They did not march in great armies like the Hittites. They did not bring siege engines or chariot squadrons. Instead, they came in swift, scattered raids, striking villages, stealing cattle, burning crops, and then disappearing into the desert before Egypt's soldiers could respond. The Libyans were masters of survival in the harsh western desert. Lightly armed, fast-moving, they were difficult to pin down. They wore feathers in their hair, carried javelins and bows, and relied on speed rather than heavy armor. To the disciplined Egyptian infantry, they were shadows, always attacking where least expected. Pharaohs could not ignore them. The western delta was too fertile, too valuable. If the Libyans were left unchecked, they could cripple Egypt's food supply. And so, campaign after campaign was launched into the desert. Pharaohs led expeditions westward, driving the Libyans back, burning their camps, and seizing captives. But the problem was deeper. Unlike the Hittites or Nubians, the Libyans had no single king to defeat. Crushing one tribe only left space for another to rise. Their pressure never ceased. Even as Egypt triumphed against great empires abroad, the Libyans gnawed at the kingdom's edges. Imagine the frustration of an Egyptian commander. He marches for weeks, his men exhausted, chasing rumors of Libyan raiders. When he finally finds them, they scatter, vanishing into dunes and rocky ravines. Victories are bloody but temporary. The desert swallows the enemy as if they were never there. And yet, out of this endless war came change. The Libyans began to settle in Egypt itself, first as captives and mercenaries, later as communities within the Nile Valley. Pharaohs, realizing they could not simply destroy them, began to use them. Libyan warriors fought as auxiliaries in Egypt's armies, serving in foreign campaigns. Some even rose to positions of power. But there was danger in this solution. By the end of the new kingdom, Libyan chiefs in Egypt grew so influential that they became pharaohs themselves, founding entire dynasties. What began as border skirmishes turned into political transformation. The Libyans teach us a hard truth. Not every enemy can be defeated by battle alone. Some are absorbed. Some become part of the very kingdom they once threatened. But Egypt's challenges were not only in the west. To the south, another power was always rising, the Nubians. Strong, resourceful, and ambitious, they were both Egypt's greatest trade partners and its most dangerous southern threat. Number 8. Nubia, Egypt's southern rival and ally. What happens when your neighbor is both your richest source of wealth and your fiercest enemy? That was the story of Nubia. South of Egypt, along the Nile's narrow cataracts, lay the land of Cush. To the Egyptians, it was a land of treasures, gold mines, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals. Pharaohs coveted its riches. They also feared its warriors, tall and skilled, who knew the desert and the river with equal mastery. For centuries, Egypt's relationship with Nubia was a cycle of war and trade. In times of strength, Egypt built fortresses deep in Nubia, securing its wealth. Pharaohs like Senusret III extended their reach, carving inscriptions on rocks that declared their dominance. In times of weakness, Nubian kings struck back, reclaiming lost lands, raiding Egyptian villages, even threatening the heart of the Nile Valley. Nubian archers, in particular, were feared across the ancient world. They carried longbows of remarkable power, able to pierce armor at great distances. Egyptian texts call them the bowmen of Cush, warriors whose arrows darkened the sky. In open battle, Egyptian soldiers dreaded facing them. But war was only half the story. There was also deep cultural exchange. Nubian soldiers served in Egypt's armies, sometimes as elite mercenaries. Nubian chiefs adopted Egyptian gods, hieroglyphs, and even burial styles. Over time, the border between Egypt and Nubia blurred, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through trade. Yet the rivalry never disappeared. In Egypt's moments of weakness, Nubian kings rose in strength. By the 8th century BCE, Nubia did more than raid Egypt, they conquered it. Kings from Cush became pharaohs, ruling as the 25th dynasty. In their reign, the symbols of Egypt and Nubia merged, a reminder that yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's ruler. Imagine an Egyptian soldier standing on a fortress wall at Semna, looking south across the Nile rapids. He knows wealth flows from that horizon. He also knows danger does. For him, Nubia is both lifeblood and shadow. Egypt's struggles with Nubia reveal a deeper truth. No kingdom survives alone. Allies and enemies are often the same people, shifting with the tide of power. But Nubia was not the only challenge. From the east, across the Sinai, came another flood of danger, the mysterious Sea Peoples. Raiders who struck like a storm and threatened to sweep Egypt away forever. Number 9. The Sea Peoples storm on the horizon. What happens when danger comes not from land, but from the sea? For Egypt, the answer was written in fire and ruin. Sometime around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was thrown into chaos. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries, Hutti, Ugarit, even mighty Mycenaean palaces, collapsed in waves of violence. At the heart of this catastrophe were mysterious invaders, known only as the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Pirates? Refugees? Warriors displaced by famine and disaster? No one knows for certain. What is clear is that they came in great fleets, families and warriors together, striking coastal cities with terrifying force. And their eyes soon turned to the greatest prize of all, the land of Egypt. Egyptian inscriptions tell us of these battles in dramatic detail. Pharaoh Merneptah first faced them, defeating them in a bloody clash. But the storm did not end. Decades later, under Ramses III, the Sea Peoples returned in force. This time, they brought not just ships, but ox carts and children, suggesting they were not raiding but migrating, seeking new lands to settle. Imagine standing on the coast of the Nile Delta. On the horizon, dark shapes appear, ships with curved prows, sails billowing, packed with warriors carrying strange round shields and long swords. Behind them, more ships follow, stretching as far as the eye can see. An invasion not of hundreds, but tens of thousands. Ramses III prepared Egypt for war like never before. He fortified the delta, massed archers along the banks, and deployed his chariot forces inland. When the Sea Peoples landed, they were met by volleys of arrows, storms of spears, and Egyptian warships that rammed and shattered their vessels. The battle was fierce. Sea Peoples fought with reckless courage, wading through waves, clashing hand-to-hand with Egyptian soldiers. But Egypt's discipline and preparation held. Ramses III himself claimed victory, boasting that the invaders were trapped and slaughtered, lying in heaps. For Egypt, this was not just another war. It was survival. The Hittites, once Egypt's great rivals, were destroyed by these same invaders. Coastal cities across the Levant were reduced to ashes. If Ramses III had failed, Egypt might have fallen into the same abyss. And yet, victory came at a cost. Though Egypt repelled the sea peoples, the kingdom was never the same. Resources drained, trade routes shattered, and enemies still pressing at other borders left Egypt weakened. The age of empire was nearing its twilight. But for the moment, Egypt had survived. The Nile still flowed, the Pharaohs still ruled, and the temples still echoed with hymns of triumph. Still, one question lingers. How long can even the strongest kingdom endure when surrounded by enemies and drained by endless wars? Number 10. Twilight of power, when defenses fail. What happens when the shield begins to crack? When the walls that once held back enemies begin to crumble? By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt faced this reality. For centuries, it had fought off Libyans, Nubians, Hittites, and the Sea Peoples. It had built fortresses, trained charioteers, and armed its soldiers with bronze and iron. But no army, no matter how mighty, can fight forever. The Libyans, once scattered raiders, were now settled inside Egypt. They were no longer just enemies beyond the western desert. They were rulers within the Nile Valley. By the 21st dynasty, Libyan chiefs had taken control of large parts of the kingdom. Egyptian soldiers now served Libyan warlords, fighting in civil conflicts rather than defending Egypt's borders. To the south, Nubia rose once more. Once subjects of Egypt, the Nubians seized their moment. As Egypt weakened, Nubian kings from Kush marched north. They did not come as raiders this time. They came as conquerors. By the 8th century BCE, the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty were Nubian, ruling Egypt in the name of both Ammonius and their own gods. And beyond these threats, new powers stirred. The Assyrians, ruthless and relentless, smashed kingdoms across the Near East. Their iron weapons and siege machines were unlike anything Egypt had faced before. When they turned their gaze on the Nile, even pharaohs could not stop them. The twilight of Egypt's military power was not sudden. It was a long unraveling. Garrisons went unpaid. Soldiers turned mercenary. Fortresses crumbled from neglect. Armies that once marched proudly into Asia now struggled to defend their own homeland. But perhaps the most tragic enemy was not Libyan or Nubian or Assyrian. It was within. Civil war, divided rule, and corruption drained Egypt from the inside. Generals and priests competed with pharaohs for power. The unity that once gave Egypt strength fractured, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. And yet, Egypt never truly disappeared. Even as foreign empires conquered it, even as its armies faded, the legacy of its military lived on. The fortresses in Nubia, the chariots of Ramses, the walls of the Delta, all stood as reminders that for nearly 2,000 years, Egypt had defended its kingdom with courage, strategy, and relentless will. The twilight came. But before it, there was brilliance, and that brilliance still echoes today, carved into temple walls and buried beneath desert sands. So the question remains, was Egypt's true strength its soldiers and fortresses, or the spirit of a people who, for millennia, refused to bow to the tide of history? Conclusion: the eternal defenders of the Nile. From the dawn of the Old Kingdom to the storms of the New, Egypt's story is one of defense, of a land that refused to be broken. Its armies were not always the strongest, nor its walls the highest. Yet for centuries, Egypt endured against Libyan raiders, Nubian bowmen, Hittite chariots, and the Sea People's fleets. Through discipline, adaptation, and sheer will, it stood when other empires crumbled. But the story of Egypt's military is not just about battles. It is about the people who lived them. The archer on the fortress wall, staring into the desert night. The charioteer gripping his reins as enemy wheels thundered toward him. The pharaoh who raised his spear not only as a king, but as a defender of his people. In time, Egypt's power waned. Foreign kings ruled its throne. Yet the memory of its defenses, the brilliance of its strategies, and the courage of its soldiers lived on. And perhaps that is Egypt's greatest victory. Not in the wars it won, nor the lands it conquered, but in the story it left behind. A story that, Thousands of years later, we still tell, still remember, still marvel at. The defenders of the Nile never truly fell.